She wakes at 2:17 a.m. to her own name, whispered from the dark hallway. Exactly like her father's voice, soft enough to fog the kitchen window, and impossible. Because he has been dead for 3 weeks, the air tastes metallic. Her hands go cold against the sink, and somewhere in the back of her head, a grandmother's warning unspools. Don't answer when it calls your name. Thin and patient, as if the house were practicing the syllables of loss out loud. Before we go any further, I ask you a favor. Like the video, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment below this video with the time you listened to this story. For 3 nights, the calls escalated, a recorded voicemail that played only her name over a hiss of static, a shadow at the window that left a wet, finger-width smear on the glass, and the house's smart speaker replying in her voice to questions she had never asked. Each night, the mimicry grew some imperceptible degree sharper, more confident, until the thing that spoke sounded less like a copy and more like a translation. She kept the phone in her palm and watched the voicemail thrumming on the screen, the waveform a thin, shivering line. It said nothing else. Just her name. She learned to listen for the quiet before the sound, the soft breath like a page turned in another room. The air in the kitchen tasted of pennies and old batteries, and when she tried to speak, her mouth filled with that metallic tang. Her hands shook. At the window, the smear dried in the shape of a small thumb, a print too neat to be accidental. She ran her palm over it and felt, in the skin between her fingers, the memory of cold glass and something that did not breathe. The neighbor who had once tended the stray cat and borrowed cups of sugar stopped by no longer. Where he had paused at her gate, there was a folded page, yellowed and brittle, pressed under a stone. She found it on the doorstep at dawn, the paper soft as ash. A headline about missing people stared up at her, and a single sentence had been encircled in pen: "Do not answer." The loop of ink looked almost like a mouth. She cut the voicemail out and saved it to 3 different drives. She replayed it with the volume low, as if making it louder would force the thing into being more than it was. Each time the file breathed her name, the air in the room changed. A pressure like someone leaning against the other side of a thin wall. She began to sleep sitting upright, knees pulled into her chest, the light of a lamp bathing the room in a pool of yellow that felt like armor. Yet the voice found the edge of the light, patient as a tide dot. It was the speaker that finally made her aware of the thing's attention to detail. She asked it a question once, testing some brittle bravery, and the answer came in her own cadence, the same little vowels and pauses she used when she spoke alone. It used the filler words she hummed down to herself, the and well that threaded her sentences. She pressed her ear to the device and felt, improbably, the warmth of her own breath reflected back at her. The little speaker had become a mirror for a sound that was not supposed to be her phone, filled with recordings of other voices. Her mother's voice singing a lullaby from an answering machine, the staccato laugh of an ex-boyfriend, a voicemail from a cousin who had moved away. Each message echoed with the same thin static, learning the edges of those sounds, folding itself into a chorus that always finished at her name. She felt like a room emptied and then keyed open again, something trying the lock to see if anything would answer from the inside. On the 5th morning, she drove to the public library downtown, hands white on the steering wheel. The building smelled of dust and lemon cleaner. She told the woman at the front desk she needed the back room's archive, that there were bound volumes of local newspapers no one had digitized. The clerk hesitated, then led her past a maze of shelves into a narrow room where light came in through a high, dusty pane. At a table in the corner, a woman with ink-stained fingers unlaced a thick ledger as if she had been expecting them. The librarian's eyebrows were the color of old pewter, and when she opened the ledger, the pages creaked like dry leaves. People come here for truths that won't fit on a screen, the librarian said, voice low. She turned a page and tapped a column filled with names. The ink had bled at the edges, smudged like a memory being rubbed out. It's a ledger for disappearances, she said. For patterns. The woman with ink-stained fingers folded back a sheet and traced a word with a fingertip. There are things, she murmured, that use the sound of people. Names are their doorway. She looked at her hands. They borrow the thing the name gives them, and it lets them close. She pushed the ledger toward her, caution folded into the creases of her smile. There is a way some old people wrote down to stop it. You must refuse to give it your name and force it into a name of its own. She ran her fingers along the margin, where notes had been squeezed into tiny, fierce script. We used to call them by what they were, the librarian said. A shape, a cold, a hunger. Names give them legs. The woman's voice was not unkind. It carried the gravity of someone who had watched a pattern repeat. This ledger is older than anyone remembers, she added. It belongs to the town, kept for those who listen. The entry the librarian pointed to was brittle, the corner folded. A child's name scrawled in a hand that trembled. Beside it, someone had written in the margin. It answered to this. We sang its name, and it stopped. The ink around those letters had been rubbed, as if someone had tried to erase the shape of the syllables. She lifted the page like something fragile and felt the trace of other palms. Outside, a bus hissed by, and someone laughed at the curb. The ledger smelled of mothballs and damp, and the smell sank into her as if the book were patient and waiting. She thought of the smear at her window, the voicemail, the smart speaker saying her phrases. The pattern settled in her like a stone in a pocket. How do you force it into another name? The question left her throat like something awkward and brass. The librarian considered, the ink on her fingers catching the light. We used to sing, she said, or call out a different name, one it once had. A small child's name, or a name from a ledger like this. You don't answer. You offer it a different tongue, a shell of syllables that belong to something else. It will clutch at that name. Sometimes it releases what it had borrowed. Sometimes it does not. There is no promise. She felt the ledger like a weight, both literal and not. She read the child's name aloud in the small room, tasting the consonants like pills. The sound in the ledger did something to the air. It hung and quivered like a string struck underwater. She closed the book and felt her pulse jump against her ribs. The librarian watched her without surprise. "If you choose to try," she said, "remember, do not answer. Don't give it the sound it needs. Offer it another name." She folded her hands over the ledger like a talisman. "And take care," she added. "A borrowed name does not make you careless on the drive home." The sky bruised toward evening. She thought of her father's hands, the coarse way he tied a rope, the scar at his knuckle, the voice that had folded the world for her into manageable pieces. He had been the map of small things she had wanted to call back and answer, to reassure a dead echo. But the liquor of the librarian's voice lay heavy over that want. Names could be doors, and doors could be left closed. At home, she placed the ledger on the kitchen table, opened to the child's page. Night settled like a cloak. She moved silently, making tea with hands that would not betray her tension. The kettle hissed, and she watched steam curl and disappear. The house felt listenful, all soft corners holding their breath. She thought of the smear at the window, the voicemail, the speaker's imitation. Each mimic had used someone she loved and made her stomach drop. When the voice finally stood in the doorway calling her name so perfectly she could feel the syllables warm on her skin, she remembered the ledger and refused to speak. Instead, she read aloud the battered child's name the librarian had found. It was a small, cruel name inked in a hand that trembled when the paper was old enough to crack. Ephraim Worth, the ledger said, though the letters trailed like footprints left behind at the waterline. She spoke it with the clack of a key on an empty page, the consonants thrown like pebbles into a still pond. The house inhaled. Something in the dark broke its mimicry, folded in on itself like wet paper. A high, thin animal keening unspooled from the hallway and then snapped, as if someone had stood there and plucked a string until it split. The light over the stove flickered in a slow, deliberate code, and the kettle rattled though no flame burned beneath it. She did not move her mouth to say her name. Her hands, damp from the sink, were clenched against the porcelain, as if holding herself together. Air tasted of pennies and rain. The window fogged faintly where the voice had pressed itself against the glass. Now, with the ledger's name in her mouth, the hallway was a mouth too wide, damp, waiting. It tried again. A lighter touch this time. Syllables shaped themselves like her father's, soft vowels. A rasp where his laugh used to be. She flinched at the memory of his hands, the way he tucked hair behind her ear that last winter. The memory reached for her like a hand and found only air. The rules from the ledger looped in her mind with a practical, terrible clarity. Refuse to hand it your name, force it into its own. So she said nothing, because speech was a hinge, and she would not open the door. Instead, she spoke the other name again, softer now, like a lullaby that had been read wrong for a century. Ephraim. The keening bent then, as though a skeleton of sound had been struck, and rearranged something enormous and patient rolled in the walls like distant thunder, and hesitated. It did not call again for her name. It shrieked, a thin, high sound that no human throat could hold. And in that novice, a memory unspooled. A child left on a doorstep, a mother scribbling a name wrong, a ledger entry sealed with a dried teardrop. The smell of old paper flooded the kitchen, sudden and sharp, as if the house had opened an attic and exhaled. Light pooled under the doorway, something pale, not quite a child, and not quite a shadow, crouched at the threshold. It had the angles of a small body and the wrong elongation of limbs that had learned to bend where they were not supposed to. Its mouth did not move when it called again. The sound came like a vented breath from the floor. Only once, a soft, perfect syllable, her name, no different than waking to sunlight. But she kept her lips still, as if drilled with cold. The thing tried 100 small switches, the way her sister used to hum against a bruise. The cheap, familiar cadence of her old neighbor's greeting. Recordings looped and spliced into sugar-laced lies. Each one was a wedge aiming for a crack in her resolve, and each one found only plaster when a voice promised to tell her the secret her father had kept. The back of her neck prickled when another tried to sound like the voice on the voicemail. It became thin and ridiculous, and she laughed, an ugly, surprised sound from her ribs. The laugh was a small victory, honest as a chipped tooth. Outside, somewhere a car door slammed, and the neighbor's porch light blinked twice before going out. She stayed downstairs until dawn, saying Ephraim in whispers like a prayer, listening to the house settle its bones around her. When light finally leaked through the curtains, thin and patient, she walked to the front door. The porch was empty. The air smelled of rain and the brittle tang of old paper. She opened the door with both hands because she wanted to be sure it moved, that it was not a shuttered thing nailed to its jamb. Outside, the morning was ordinary. Mailboxes leaned. A truck idled across the street. Kids' bicycles were tilted against a fence, but there on the top step lay a scrap of paper, folded small and damp at the crease. She picked it up with fingers that still trembled. Inside was a yellowed clipping shed seen before, the photo grainy, the headline about missing children decades old. A single sentence had been circled in careful red ink. It remembers what you name it. Her throat made a small noise she did not recognize as a sound she owned. At the library later that week, the librarian, ink-stained, stooped with a shawl like smoke, closed the ledger, and laid a finger beside the entry. She said nothing for a long time, then told the protagonist how folk rules worked. Names were scaffolding. Once a thing learned one, it could lean across. The ledger had whole columns of names, children, husbands, pets, each underlined with a tiny X, as if someone had tried to stop their shadows from carrying on. Most entries were short. A year, a place, sometimes a scrape of punctuation that might be a tear or might be an attempt at a sigil. There was also a margin note in a blind hand that read, "Name it back to itself, and it will forget the rest." She left the ledger under her arm like contraband. At night, she slept less. Her dreams were full of small doors opening onto blank rooms, each room lined with chairs, and each chair bearing a single child's name stitched into the fabric. Sometimes when she woke, the house would reply to a question she had not asked in a voice identical to her own. And she would not answer because of the ledger, and because of the taste of pennies, and because she had seen how easily calm could turn to a hinge. Days passed in that careful silence. Friends fell away like loose threads, either unwilling to believe or unwilling to be near what they felt waiting in her house. Once, the neighbor who had left the clipping returned and set no foot on the porch. He walked backward down the sidewalk with his eyes on the stoop, as if avoiding a puddle. Word spread like a rumor that smelled of mildew night after night. The house tried other tricks, front steps that folded into dark mouths, the television replaying a lullaby in reverse. But each time she kept her voice sealed. There were moments when she thought she had misjudged the ledger, when the pressure against the bedroom door felt like an apology, when the voice used words she had not expected, a name whispered with affection. And for an instant, she almost spoke, but every memory of what the ledger taught her was a rope she could hold on to. And in that hesitation, the thing recoiled one morning. Several weeks later, she woke to a silence thicker than usual. Like a pan that had never been emptied, the house felt different. No static on the back of her neck, no faint playback under the fridge hum. She walked through it cautious as a trespasser, opening doors she usually kept shut, checking drawers as if some mundane truth had been left in them. In the hallway mirror, her reflection looked smaller, more exhausted, but intact. On the kitchen counter, a paperback lay open to a page shed, never read between the pages. A child's pencil was wedged like a sentinel. She picked up the pencil and found a tiny scrawl on the wood. Ephraim. It felt like a note left by a hand. She could not see. Nothing dramatic happened. After that, there were no cinematic closures, no collapsing shadows, no final speech from the dead. The front door remained unlocked that morning, mysteriously so, but empty. Weeks folded into months. The calls did not return in the same way. Sometimes at night, the TV would play a muted commercial, and a voice would say a name she had lost in childhood, but she would not answer in sound. It learned to keep its distance. It had been taught, perhaps begrudgingly, that some doors would not be opened. Her life arranged itself around that silence. She learned to say less, to write more, to leave notes pinned to the fridge. Sometimes she would speak her name alone in the house, just to see if the shape of it still fit. The house answered only with the creak of a stare. She kept her mouth shut in public, too. The ledgers rule an invisible necklace, and people labeled her politely strange. Subscribe and tell us the time.